Islam has a big problem. Okay, it's got a lot of problems, but we're only going to focus on one today, and that's the one found in Quran 7:157. It says, they are the ones who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whose description they find in the Torah and the Gospel. Now, according to this, we should be able to find the prophet of Islam in the Torah and the Gospel. Now, where can we expect to find that? Well, specifically, if we look at the footnote says that we should be able to find him Deuteronomy 18, already debunked that. 33:2, we're going to look at that. And Isaiah 42, which is what we're going to talk about today. But it's really funny that it's even in this list, because whoever put this footnote in here did not read the verse. What does the verse say? The verse says that they should find him in the Torah and the Gospel. Well, Isaiah 42 is a prophet, and he's a major prophet, and that is not Torah and the Gospels. So anyway, we're just going to overlook that one now. Let's just let that one slide. So let's look at this first point here. Here's my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. Well, the New Testament explicitly says this is about Jesus. In fact, Matthew 12 quotes this and says, behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved one whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my servant spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. Now, even the Quran says that only Jesus comes from the Spirit. Jesus is the Spirit. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah. He was much more than that, but that's for another day. And his word which he conveyed unto Mary, and a spirit from him. Interestingly, this is never said of Muhammad. Muhammad never was said to be of the Spirit, led of the Spirit, had the Spirit, or was a Spirit, but it does say this of Jesus. So the Quran is actually affirming that Jesus is the one with the Spirit. Let's go to point number 2. It says, he will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. In his teaching the islands will put their hope. Now, let's just pause for a minute and say the prophet snuffed out a lot of people. He was involved in around 86 battles, and there were many he snuffed out. And in fact, if we read the Quran, he talks about snuffing out, which is another word for unaliving somebody, unaliving a bunch of people. For example, Quran 9:29 talks about that. Quran 9:5. We'll not get into that for now, but he unalived and snuffed out many a people. So this doesn't fit the servant, but it does fit Jesus. In fact, once again, we see in Matthew 12, that he quotes Isaiah 42 with this specific verse. He says, this is in Matthew, he will not quarrel or cry out, no one will hear his voice in the streets, a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. This is about Jesus, is what Matthew says. Let's go to the next point. It says this in verse 6, I, the Lord, have called you, the servant, in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. Now the Lord here is Yahweh. Would we say of the prophet of Islam that Yahweh, the God of Israel, called him and would take hold of his hand? I think that many Muslims would have a problem with this, to say that Yahweh is the God of Muhammad, especially since in Isaiah, I think it's 64:65, it calls Yahweh the Father. But let's go on. Number 4, it says, I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. We see this in verse 6. It says the servant is the covenant. The covenant is a person. And it says, I will give you as a covenant for the people, a light for the nations. Now, covenants are established by blood and by death. We see a little nuance of that here, for it says in Hebrews, for where a covenant is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. But we see throughout the Old Testament animal sacrifices and the blood that was required and the death that was required of that sacrifice to establish and ratify a covenant. Now Jesus, in referring to the cross, he said, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And in Luke it says it again, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Jesus is the covenant. Jesus fulfills this, which he did on the cross. Now, Islam prophet is not a covenant and couldn't be unless he sacrificed himself through blood and through death. And we know how Islam's prophet died. He was in a battle. He killed this newlywed's husband and father, and she fixed him a meal shortly thereafter and poisoned it and said to herself, if he eats this and lives, then he is a prophet, the prophet who just murdered my husband and father. And Muhammad, he ate the woman's food that he just murdered her family, and he got sick from the poison, and he eventually died. So there was no blood here. There was not a covenant made here. He wasn't a covenant, whereas Jesus was the covenant. Number 5. It says in verse 7 that the servant will open eyes that are blind and free captives from prison and release from the dungeon of those who sit in darkness. Now this is going to blow your mind, at least if you're an honest seeker. Jesus quotes this verse and says it's about me. He went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, which is Isaiah 42, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He's quoting this chapter here. And then he rolls up the scroll. He gives it back to the attendant and sat down, and the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus said, this scripture is about me. Now, interestingly, let's look at the prophet of Islam. Islam's prophet says that he could do more miracles. In fact, people are asking him, according to the Quran, where's the signs? Where's your signs? Where's proof that you're really who you say you are? And he's like, no, that's not more for me. I'm just a warner. And he says this throughout the Quran. He could do no miracles according to the Quran. But Jesus, on the other hand, it says of Jesus in the Quran that he could cure the blind and the leper and give life to the dead. So we have to look at the text is really what decides the meaning. The New Testament explicitly identifies Jesus as Isaiah's 42 servant. He doesn't snuff out the bruised or broken. The servant is called and led by Yahweh, God of Israel. The servant is the new covenant. The servant performs miracles. And Jesus himself says this is him. Muhammad does not fit any of these. Only Jesus, proving that he truly is who he says he is.